Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, and let yourself be carried away by the story. Off to sleep in peace. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. First, every civilization is shaped first by its geography, and Egypt's geography was, in essence, a single river. The Nile flooded with such reliability that the Egyptians built their entire calendar, their agriculture, and much of their religious imagination around its rhythms. Out of this flood came barley and emmer wheat, the grains that fed the population, and, just as importantly, the grains that became beer. Out of the fertile black soil along Gaul, Vlanks and Vines, flax, and eventually the poppies and water lilies that would shape Egyptian medicine and ritual for thousands of years. It is worth pausing on this point, because it explains something essential about how the Egyptians approached the substances we now call drugs. They did not experiment with them the way a modern person might experiment with a new product out of curiosity or boredom. Plants in ancient Egypt were resources studied and then used. Any agricultural society studies and uses its land. A flower that eased pain was no more or less remarkable in the Egyptian worldview than the grain that could be fermented into bread or beer. The boundary between medicine, food, and ritual substance. Boundary. And it feels important to Ortons today. Barely existed in the ancient Nile Valley. This is the lens through which the rest of this story should be understood. When we speak of opium, of blue lotus, of wine and beer in ancient Egypt, we are not describing a society indulging in vice. We are describing a society building slowly and empirically one of the world's earliest systems of applied pharmacology. Chapter 2. Beer, the drink of the people. If wine in Egypt was the drink of gods and nobles, beer was the drink of everyone else, and its importance to Egyptian life can hardly be overstated or stated. Archaeological evidence place organized beer production in Egypt as far back as pre-dynastic period, well before the construction of the pyramids. Beer was thick, often consumed through a straw to out the grain residue still suspended in the liquid.
And
it was nutritionally significant, providing calories, hydration to a population that depended on grueling physical labor. Workers who built royal monuments, including the pyramids at Giza, received beer as part of their daily rations. A fact confirmed by administrative records found at workers' settlements near the construction sites. This was not an indulgence granted to laborers as a reward. It was payment, as fundamental tool to their compensation as bread. The mild alcohol content of Egyptian beer meant it could be consumed throughout the day, without significant impairment, functioning more as a caloric staple than as an intoxicant. In the modern sense, religious life absorbed beer just as thoroughly as daily life did. Temples brewed beer as offerings to the gods and certain festivals, including one dedicated to the goddess Hathor, involved ritualized mass intoxication, understood not as disorderly indulgence, but as a sacred act connecting celebrants to the divine. The Egyptians, in other words, built into intoxication into the architecture of their religious calendar, treating altered states of consciousness as a legitimate, even necessary, part of honoring their gods. Chapter 3. And the architecture of status. Wine occupied a different social position entirely. In where beer was abundant and democratic, wine relatively scarce, requiring vineyards, careful cultivation, and processes more labor-intensive than brewing. As a result, became closely associated with the elite, with royal households, temple priesthoods, and the upper strata of Egyptian society who could afford its cultivation and storage. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom period frequently deep wine pre-production in remarkable detail, showing workers treading grapes in vats. The juice collected and stored in large ceramic vessels, sealed and labeled, in some cases, with the vineyard of the end, the vintage year, and even the name of the chief vintner. An early form of quality control and provenance tracking would knock entirely out of place in a modern winery. Wine's association with the afterlife gave it particular weight in Egyptian religious thought. Tomb inventories regularly included jars of wine meant to accompany a deceased into the next world. A provision for what the Egyptians had understood as a continuation of earthly life beyond death. The god Osiris, ruler of the underworld, was himself associated with viticulture in some traditions, reinforcing wine's big twink between earthly pleasure and the promise of eternal life. Chapter 4. The Physicians of the Nile. To understand how the Egyptians use substances like opium and henbane, it helps to understand who was doing the prescribing. Egyptian medicine was practiced by a class of trained specialists. Sanu, the Sanu who held genuine social standing and who left behind, through papyri like the Ebers and Edwin Smith documents, some of the most detailed surviving records of ancient medical practice anywhere in the world. These physicians operated within a worldview that blended what we would now sanct categories. Observation, religious belief, and magical practice. A wound might be treated with a poultice whose ingredients had genuine antiseptic properties. Then, in case, invoking a protector deity. This was not seen as contradictory. Disease, in the Egyptian understanding, could result from natural causes, from displeasure of a god, or from the malicious influence of a hostile spirit, and treatment often addressed all three possibilities simultaneously. Within this framework, plant-based remedies occupied a central place. The Ebers Papyrus alone contains more than 700 remedies and formulas, drawing on hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral substances. Among them, preparations now widely believed by historians of medicine to involve opium extract, specifically and in context, involving pain relief and the calming of distressed patients, including notably young children. Chapter 5, The Poppy's Route to Egypt. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, was not native to Egypt. Its cultivation appears to trace back the western Mediterranean and the regions with modern-day Turkey and the Aegean areas with which Egypt maintained active trade contact for centuries before the New Kingdom. The exact route by which opium reached the Nile Valley remains a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation. But residue analysis of ceramic vessels, particularly a distinctive type juglet known as the base ring juglet, has provided some of the most compelling physical evidence. These juglets, manufactured primarily in Cyprus and Libris, widely distributed across the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age, bear a shapes strikingly similar to an inverted, sliced poppy seed pod. For decades, archaeologists debated whether this resemblance was coincidental or intentional, essentially a form of ancient branding indicating the contents within. Chemical residue analysis conducted on several of these vessels has since detected traces of sphelium with opium alkaloids, lending strong support to the theory that these containers were used specifically to transport and trade opium across the ancient world, with Egypt as one of their key destinations. By the time of the New Kingdom, opium became sufficiently established in Egyptian medical practice that physicians clearly understood, at least empirically, its capacity to relieve pain and induce sleep, even without a chemical understanding the alkaloids responsible for those effects. Chapters 6, Calming the Crying Child. Among the most frequently cited passages from the Ebers Papyrus is a remedy tended to quiet a child who cries excessively. A preparation involving a substance many historians of medicine as SPN or sheepen, generally translated as referring to the poppy. The remedy instructs that the preparigi strained and given child with the explicit goal of inducing hum and sleep. This single passage tells us great about Egyptian medical practice. It tells us that Egyptian physicians had identified a substance capable liably sedating a young child, a fact that required careful, repeated observation to establish with any confidence. It tells us dosage and preparation were important enough. The army arrived. in this to be used of practitioners, and it tells us that the relief of suffering, even minor, everyday suffering like an inconsolable ill infant, was considered a legitimate and worthy goal of medical practice, deserving its own documented remedy. Whether modern parents would consider such a practice advisable is, of course, different question. This account makes no attempt to answer. What matters historically is this remedy represents one of the earliest documented of opium specifically for pediatric sedation anywhere in the ancient world. Chapter 7, Surgery without anesthesia and the search for relief. Ancient Egyptian medicine included a surprising range of surgical interventions. From the setting of broken bones, documented in remarkable detail in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, to circumcision, to treatment of abscesses and tumors. None of these procedures could rely on anything resembling modern anesthesia, and the pain involved must have been, by any honest accounting, severe. It was within this context that opium's pain-relieving properties found their most serious application, while direct documentary evidence linking opium's heal surpletus procedures remains limited. Broader pharmacological record makes clear that Egyptian physicians possessed and used substance capable of dulling pain and inducing drowsiness for undertaking painful treatments. Mandrake root, prepared as a wine infusion, is referenced in later Greco-Roman medical texts as having been used for precisely this practice plausibly inherited, at least in Erota, from earlier Egyptian tradition. Given even extensive transmission of medical knowledge between Egypt and the Greek world during the centuries that followed, the broader picture that emerges is one of physicians' work within the Thinsians, doing everything within their power, with the tools available to them, to reduce a patient's suffering during procedures that today would considered unthinkable without anesthesia. Chapter 8. The Blue Lotus in Daily and Sacred Life. Return for a moment to the Blue Lotus, Nymphaea Caerulea, and the question of how exactly it was used. Tings depict the flower in two recurrent texts, held to the nose at banquets, and floating in bowls placed before the deceased in funerary scenes. Both contexts suggest a substance-valued experience rather than a cure, something closer to what we would now describe as recreational or ceremonial use. Modern phytochemical analysis has identified compounds within the blue lotus, including apomorphine and nuciferine, capable of producing relaxation, mild euphoria, alt euphoria, and altered perception. When extracted properly, particularly when steeped in wine, a preparation method that may have enhanced the release of its compounds. Whether ancient Egyptians achieved sufficiently concentrated preparations to produce strong psychoactive effects, or whether the flower's role was primarily symbolic and aromatic, remains genuinely debated among researchers. And this account claims certainty where the evidence itself remains. What is certain is the flower's symbolic weight. The blue lotus closes at night and sinks beneath the water's surface, only to reopen and rise again with the dawn. To the Egyptians, steeped in a worldview centered on cyclical renewal and rebirth, this daily resurrection made the flower an almost irresistible symbol of life persisting beyond death, a meaning reinforced every time it appeared in funerary art. Regardless, whatever physical sensation its use may or may not have produced. Chapter 9, Mandrake, and the power of the human-shaped root. Few plants in the ancient world carried as much mystique as the mandrake. Mandragora, Fla, whose forked, often unsettlingly human-shaped root made it an object of medical, superstitious fascination from Egypt through and Greece and Rome. Mandrake contains tropon alkaloids, including scopolamine and hyoscyamine, compounds capable of producing sedation, pain relief, and at higher doses, delirium and hallucination. Egyptian artistic and literary sources depict mandrake fruit in contexts suggesting both medicinal use and association with fertility and desire. Appearing in love poetry and decorative motif alongside other symbols of vitality. Its sedative properties, meanwhile, made it valuable in medical contexts requiring the dulling of pain, or the inducement of sleep, uses that Greek and Roman physicians would later document with considerably more precision, often crediting earlier Egyptian and Near Eastern annals as part of the broader inherited tradition. Building upon the danger of mandrake lay precisely in the narrow margin between its therapeutic and toxic doses, a margin that required real expertise to navigate safely. Expertise concentrated among trained physicians and priests rather than distributed broadly across general population. Chapter 10, Henbane and the boundaries of safe use. Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, sat even further along the spectrum toward danger. Like mandrake, it contained alkaloids capable of producing sedation and pain relief in small doses, but capable of producing severe poisoning, hallucinate, and death at only slightly higher amounts. Its presence in the Egyptian and broader ancient Mediterranean pharmacological record reflects society willing to work with genuinely dangerous substances when the potential medical benefit justified the risk, provided the knowledge to use safely existed, and was respected. The willingness of Egyptian and later Greek and Roman physicians to engage with plants this hazardous, tells us something important about ancient Mesoplint is its use discipline. It was not a system of folk superstition operating blindly. It was a system, however imperfect by modern scientific standards, built on generations of accumulated, carefully transmitted empirical observation, in which the line between remedy and poison was understood to be a matter of degree, requiring real skill to manage responsibly. Chapter 11. Knowledge crosses the sea. By the time Rome to dominance across the Mediterranean, it inherited a body of medical and pharmacological knowledge that had already passed through multiple civilizations. Egyptian medical practice had influenced Greek medicine for centuries, partly through direct contact, and through the Hellenistic period following Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt, when Alexandria became one of the ancient world's great centers of scholarship, housing physicians, scholars from across the known world. Rome, in turn, absorbed Greek medical knowledge almost wholesale, often through Greek physicians who practiced direct within Roman society, bringing with them centuries of accumulated pharmacological tradition that stretched back in an unbroken chain of transmission to the medical practices first documented on Egyptian pin pottery more than 1,000 years earlier. This chain of transmission matters because it means the story of drug use in the ancient world is not really two separate stories, an Egyptian story and a Roman story, but a single continuous tradition, refined and expanded as it passed from one civilization to the next. Chapter 12. Wine and the Roman social order. Roman wine culture deserves attention not simply for its scale, though that scale was genuinely enormous, with vineyards stretching across Italy and broader empire, but for the precision with which Roman society regulated and ritualized its consumption. Wine in Rome was almost never drunk undiluted. The standard practice involved mixing wine with water at a ratio that varied by occasion and status. A practice so deeply embedded in Roman identity. Drinking wine unmixed was considered a marker of barbarism of peoples beyond borders rather than civilized Roman behavior. The convivium, the Roman dinner party, structured wine consumption around elaborate social ritual, including the appointment of a symposiarch, hosted, responsible for determining the strength of the wine mixture and the pace of drinking for the evening. This was not an indulgent free-for-all. A carefully managed social institution, reflecting Roman anxieties at the loss of self-control that excessive drinking could produce, anxieties documented extensively in the writings of Roman moralists and historians. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, devoted considerable attention to wine in its natural history, cataloging varieties, discussing their qualities, and expressing genuine concern about excessive drinking among Rome's elite, treating habitual drunkenness as a moral and social failing, worthy of public criticism, a concern echoed numerous other Roman authors across the imperial period. Chapter 13: Galen and the Codification of Opium. No figure looms larger over the Roman pharmacological tradition than Galen of Pergamum, the Greek physician who built much of his career in Rome during the 2nd century CE, serving at various points as physician to several Roman emperors. Galen's surviving writings, vast in scope, represent the most comprehensive synthesis of Hippocrates and his antiquity, and his treatment of opium reflects both the sophistication and the limitations of Roman medical understanding. Galen prescribed opium extensively for pain, for insomnia, for digestive disorders, for respiratory complaints, and for a range of other conditions, reflecting opium's genuinely broad physiological effects. He understood, through careful clinical observation, rather than chemical analysis, that opium's effects scaled with dosage, and his writings include explicit warnings about the dangers of excessive use, including the risk of death from overdose, a risk he had clearly observed and taken seriously in his own practice. Galen also famously reported his own personal use of theriac, a complex compound medicine containing opium among dozens of other ingredients, originally developed a universally invert alatunt poison, but increasingly used by Galen's time as a general tonic and remedy for a wide range of ailments. Several Roman emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, are recorded as regular users of theriac, raising questions among modern historians to which long-term opium exposure may have influenced the health and behavior of Rome's ruling class. Questions it remain genuinely debated rather than definitively settled. Chapter 14: Dioscorides and the Roman Pharmacopoeia. Alongside Galen stands Pedanius Dioscora, a Greek, agreeing in the Roman military during the 1st century CE, whose great work, Gematria Magica, catalogued to more than 600 plants, along with numerous minerals and animal products, in what amounts to one of the most influential pharmacological texts in human history, remaining a standard medical reference for over 1,000 years after its composition. Dioscorides' treatment of opium is notably precise for its time, distinguishing between different methods of extraction and preparation, and explicitly warning of the dangers of excessive consumption, including the risk of fatal poisoning. He documented opium's use as a pain reliever, but acid diarrhea and a range of other conditions, while simultaneously cataloging antidotes and treatments for poisoning, evidence that Roman physicians were keenly aware of the substance's dual nature as both remedy and hazard. Dioscorides also documented mandrake, henbane, and numerous other psychoactive plants with similar care, providing Roman physicians and the many generations of physicians who relied on his work long after Rome itself had fallen, with a systematic, carefully observed reference for navigating the genuinely dangerous territory between effective medicine and lethal poison. Chapter 15: Poison, Suspicion, and the Politics of Pharmacology. The same knowledge that allowed Roman physicians heal also gave certain individuals the tools to harm, and Roman history includes numerous accounts, some certainly exaggerated, others likely accurate, of poisoning used as a political, personal weapon. The figure of the Benefica, a woman skilled in the preparation of potions and poisons, appears in a Roman literature, reflecting genuine anxiety about the misuse of pharmacological knowledge within Roman society. Roman law eventually addressed poisoning directly, with legislation imposing serious penalties for the preparation or distribution of harmful substances with malicious intent. Legislation implicitly acknowledged how widely available and how dangerous certain plant-based preparations had become across. This legal response reflects the broader Roman understanding, eroded ultimately from Egyptian and Greek pharmacological tradition, that the same substance of alleviating suffering were equally capable of causing it, and that the difference often rested entirely on the intentions and skill of the administering them. Chapter 16: A single, continuous story. Looking back across this long arc, from the Würzburg settlements near the pyramids at Giza, drinking their daily ration of beer, to the imperial court in Rome, where an emperor might take his daily dose of theriac, what emerges is not two separate histories of intoxication, but a single continuous tradition of human beings working, generation after generation, to understand the plants around them, to relieve pain, to mark sacred occasions, and to navigate narrow space between and harm. The Egyptians began this work empirically, recording their findings on papyri, intended to be read and used by physicians who had not yet been born. The Greeks expanded and systematized this knowledge. The Romans inherited, applied, and further refined it, building a pharmacological tradition sophisticated enough to remain in active use of itself had fallen across 3 civilizations and 2,000 years. The fundamental human questions remained remarkably constant. How to relieve suffering, to mark the boundary between the sacred and the everyday, and how to use powerful self-substances wisely enough to benefit from their power without falling them to it.